So how would you like to prevent bone density loss? And how would you like to prevent a risk of fracture? Pretty simple. You've got a bone that's kind of like your safe deposit box, and we're going to tell you how to keep the calcium in the bone through a couple very simple steps. I'm Dennis Grossman, MD, Cleveland, Ohio, and I'm an internist, mainly older people, but I have a practice that has been here in Cleveland for the last 30 plus years. And I got interested in nutrition probably 25, 30 years ago. Osteoporosis has to do with the calcium in the bone. We all know that it's a risk factor in terms of fractures. There's a lot of factors involved in it, but for me, there's only three essentials, and that is calcium gets in your body through the gut, it's stored in the bone, and it gets out through your urinary tract. So anything that affects the absorption, anything that affects the storage, and anything that affects the excretion contributes to loss of bone density, loss of calcium, loss of bone density, higher risk for fractures. I liken the bone as a storage unit, like your savings account. Your savings account for calcium, and what I look at is, are people borrowing from their account and losing calcium out in the urine? And there are some people that don't bring in enough, but the majority of people are borrowing too much calcium from their bone. Just like any savings account, if you borrow too much, there's nothing left in it. When we borrow from the bone, we usually borrow to buffer acidity in the bloodstream. And the more acid in the bloodstream, the more calcium we have to borrow to neutralize it. And eventually that calcium gets excreted out in the urine. So what are the things that cause acidity in the bloodstream that make us borrow from the bone? So the big thing is protein loads. The amount of protein, and proteins are amino acids. And there's acid in that name, so it gives you a little clue that the acid needs to be buffered if you have high levels of it. And our primary buffering is calcium, but there's also bicarbonate, there's other things. So high protein loads, and specifically high animal protein loads. Well, why animal protein? Because animal protein actually has more sulfate in it than phosphate. Sulfuric acid is a stronger acid, so the stronger the acid, the more you got to buffer it. And there have been studies that have shown that the higher the animal to vegetable ratio, the more acidity and the more risk there is for osteoporosis. The other issue is phosphate, because bones are made of calcium phosphate. And we also know that the higher phosphate load in the bloodstream, the more it affects the calcium excretion. There is actually a balance between calcium and phosphate. So the more phosphate you put into the system, the less calcium is going to be there. And what's critical about calcium is it is used for the nerves and muscles of the body. It's a very narrow range that has to be kept in. And in order to keep that narrow range, you got to keep borrowing from the bones. So there are hormones involved, parathyroid, calcitonin, and they are critical in terms of maintaining the homeostasis, the very narrow range of calcium. So we buffer every day the acid load. The higher the phosphate load, and again, phosphate has to do with protein. Our big phosphate ingester is cola, any type of soda that has cola in it, and it's also acidic. So those things cause calcium to be leached out of the bone and eventually out in the urine, and we got to replenish it. And the other thing that plants give that animals don't is magnesium. Chlorophyll is in green plants, so that's how they get green. And chlorophyll, the building block of chlorophyll is magnesium. So magnesium is the second most prominent, what we call cation in the bone. It's not as prominent as calcium, but when you ingest magnesium, you actually improve your pH, you allow yourself to absorb more calcium, and you maintain the homeostasis. So that ratio of animal to vegetable is important in terms of acid load and also magnesium, how much magnesium gets in the bloodstream. Acidosis caused by certain foods, high intake of protein, more intake of animal protein, which is more acidic, creates more acidity, more buffering. So in the end, we want to keep our storage or our bank account as full up as we can, and we can do that by maintaining a better ratio of animal to vegetable protein. Now that's basically kind of the minimalist view of it and the simplest way. There are a lot of other factors involved in how you absorb things and how you excrete things, but I focus on keeping the storage unit in a good shape, keeping your calcium in the bone. Yeah, so you've hit the nail on the head. If you can eliminate sugary, carbonated, cola-type beverages, water is obviously the best thing. I would say unsweetened tea, herbal stuff would be the best, less caffeine. But again, water is probably your number one beverage. And, that alone actually makes a big difference. Switching from carbonated, sugary drinks, and even the diet drinks are no better. They're sort of a great fooler to the brain. So switching to water or to herbal stuff. But if it has a lot of sugar in it, if it has a lot of caffeine in it, and if it's got phosphate in it, you kind of want to stay away from it.